Good morning and welcome to the Middle East Institute's webinar on Libya breaking out of the impasse. I'm Jonathan Weiner. I'm a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. I used to be the United States Special Envoy for Libya some years ago. And we're here today accompanied by three people with tremendous knowledge. And I want to make one more reference, which is to Intisar Fakir, who put this together for MEI and graciously asked me to moderate today in view of my background on this particular topic. We're here at an extraordinary moment with three remarkably well-qualified people to speak about it. The Special Representative of the Secretary General, Ambassador Batili, literally on Monday, talked about the breakdown in trust and the need to find a pathway to move forward on elections because of the growing lack of legitimacy of much of Libya's political system and their institutions. And he announced his creation of a high-level panel that would focus on a high-level steering panel that would focus on making elections possible, to bring together all relevant Libyan stakeholders to facilitate the adoption of a legal framework, as well as a time-bound roadmap for the holding of elections 2029, 27, 25, 24, no, in 2023, this year. So the question is that possible? How can it be made possible? What are the opportunities? What are the potential barriers? And to talk through those issues, as well as anything else that's relevant to how we break out of the impasse, we have Libya's ambassador and permanent representative of the United Nations, Tahir al-Sani. We have Stephanie Williams, who has held basically every imaginable relevant position to try and help Libya move forward, including acting special representative, senior advisor to the Secretary General. And she's now a non-resident scholar at the Brookings Institute. And then we have Mary Fitzgerald, who has more academic affiliations related to Libya than anybody I know on multiple continents, and writes often and well on the topic. We're going to start out with Tahir and ask Ambassador al-Sani to talk about how he, as Libya's ambassador and high representative, sees this current moment with the SRSG announcing this high-level steering group, what he sees as the opportunities, the risks, and what supporters of Libya can do to try and help the country move forward on the political process. Thank you, Ambassador al-Sani.
Thanks, Jonathan, for giving me this opportunity, and thanks to the Middle Eastern Institution for bringing us together. It's a pleasure to meet you all. And look, I mean, we need, in order to understand how Batili came up with this and why, it's very important to just have a very quick kind of flashback on the series of events that happened in the past years, trying to build up this kind of reasoning, why is this happening and why is it now? And I mean, if we go quickly to the nature of the conflict in Libya post 2011 and 2012, maybe many of us were, and especially in the Libyan society, were kind of not noticing, or maybe a bit naive to see, due to the type of intervention that happened, or support, if you want to call it, depends on the countries and the nature of those, the type of interventions. There was already kind of two groups being built up in terms of coalitions. And that was even during the time of trying, although there was one common goal to try to, let's say, bring down the regime, but yet there was two groups working in parallel with different goals in the future. That was very clear in 2014 when Libya Dawn happened, and then that kind of polarization was very clear. When Skhirat came in, and you, Jonathan, were one of those who witnessed it, it was meant to reunite the country, you know, and have one government of, which came out as the Government of National Accord, and then the creation of what we call now the High State Council was basically a political kind of body to kind of absorb the factions, you know, in one way. And then that's where they're still representing regional and kind of international interest indirectly through these political parties. And that had its influence on the scene. But we all know how this went. And by 2019, after the attempt to conquer Tripoli, which then failed, we had a more deep kind of challenge by having more intervention and boots on the ground, where then this polarization was very clear. Stephanie is here with us, and she was part of that, trying to now reintroduce again a national government. And that was so we can, and in every stage for Skhirat and Geneva, the idea was an interim government in order to reach elections under a certain constitutional basis. That was since that time, since the division happened after 2014. So nothing, the same idea was always there. It's just that scenarios kept going different. But if you want to go deep into the analysis, you'll see that at the end of the day, those who are intervening / those political players were always the same kind of groups divided. Even though some of them are in the east and others on the west, it's still more a geographical location than really an ideological kind of, let's say, pass for those political parties. And to prove that, you see now that certain stakeholders and certain political parties or political individuals have been going from one side to another. So it was more about political being in power sharing or trying to take advantage of the situation one way or another. So then when the government of national unity came in place after the long talks, it was always about the failure of HOR and State Council to reach consensus in a certain stage. So that's why we had to do some kind of format, Skhirat and then Geneva, to bring Libyans together. So there's always that kind of reason why, because the consensus was very impossible to happen. Of course, we share the responsibility as Libyans, but also it was because of the kind of challenges regionally, internationally. When the roadmap of Geneva, Tunisia was put, and Stephanie, I'm sure will speak about more, it was meant to have a comprehensive plan, which is an executive, then a roadmap towards elections that year. And in that roadmap, it was very clear that there is a timeline to reach a constitutional basis between State Council and HOR. And if not reached, then it maybe go back to the LPDF. So that part, when Stephanie left, and then unfortunately when Jan Kovic came in as an SRG, he didn't manage to continue that path and to continue what was meant to be in that roadmap. Therefore, we ended again with the same scenario, where then we had another government that came in and introduced, and we have the division back. Batili's kind of idea is actually a continuation, from my point of view, to what was left over from the Tunis-Geneva roadmap, in order to finalize that part and to be able to come up with this, let's say, constitutional basis agreement. Now, of course, we're faced, it's not, for me, I really don't want to go into the legal part of all of this. I don't think in Libya it's the legal question. It's more political. We can go to articles here and articles there, but that's not the point. The real problem is, if I want to sum it, is that we're, unfortunately, in order to cause change in any society, you have at least 3 ways to do that within the society. Either you have a revolution of the people coming out by themselves, not necessarily maybe with a head or a leader, but they just change, and then we start to see how things go on. This happened in 2011, but the lack of leadership that could continue to this revolution didn't really help much. The second way is that if you have an individual or a leader who can actually bring around him the mass and involve a change by a movement to cause something new on the scene. And we don't have that. The third way, unfortunately, if there's a strong military presence to a certain group who can really enforce a certain change, and we saw that nobody has a full power to do so. Since we don't have any of those 3, unfortunately, we're left under the mercy of how the regional players and international community would agree or disagree on how they want to deal with Libya. So Libya cannot be disconnected from the geopolitics and the regional challenges that are happening all around. We're actually a playground and also a result of those conflicts. I see this in the council all the time, whenever we discuss, not only in these kind of sessions on Libya, even bilaterally with other missions and stuff. It's always about, kind of what does this part want, and we'll do either the opposite, and how to bring them. I'm trying to work on consensus of international consensus more than the domestic one, and it's very challenging. So to go directly for Batili's proposal, I cannot really predict how successful that could be, because there's some questions that are not answered yet. Most importantly, his selection criteria, who will represent. This is very key and critical, because we all know in all of these different attempts, like during Skhirat or Geneva, that was always the fundamental question. And then when the group are picked, you're faced with the challenge of legitimacy of the group sitting on the table. So they'll say, so why the UN picked those? What mechanism was used to pick those? Where are the institutions that the Libyan people have voted for or let's say represent them? I know that that's not an easy thing to answer, but I'm telling you this is what Batil will be facing in the coming future in order to see a comprehensive representation. That's if he's able to take it forward. Now, there is another challenge happening why Batili might be facing serious things, and there's three main areas. The existing institutions, in particular HOR and State Council, and even the sovereign decisions institutes, are maybe the three are kind of resisting and will be resisting because the fact is it's a new change. Everybody is worried and scared about change, and it's a power struggle. So there is going to be a fair resistance against this. And if you go back, this resistance happened also before Skhirat. It happened also before Geneva. So how would Batili pull it out so we don't just go into another cycle of confrontation? That's a question to be asked. Also, the beneficiaries from the existing executive bodies that are there today, regardless of which side we're talking about. I'm talking the circles around these executives. They have maintained a certain level of power and influence that they're going to be worried to have this, unless they maybe have foreseen a future with a change. But this goes exactly on the third point, that these obstacles are also reflected with many regional and some international players, because they're worried and they're about their investment that they had for the past 10, 11 years. How would they be able to confront that by a democratic change if they don't guarantee the results that are going to come out from a democratic process? So these kind of are the challenges that we have. I don't want to take much long on that particular question, Jonathan, but I want to stress on, let's take the if scenario, okay? Because I cannot say it's going to happen or not for Batili's high-level panel. If Batili is going to go towards that, and I mentioned this in my briefing in the council, he has to be very clear that this is only focused on finalizing whatever was not done by the last transition period, which was led by the UN with Stephanie, where there's the constitutional basis part and the electoral laws. It should not divert out of that from my point of view, because that focus group on that and these obstacles is very important. We don't want to create another executive body that will take place and maybe we go into this cycle again. I know that there's two schools of thought, okay? And I understand that saying we need a unity government to run elections is technically speaking the right thing to say. You want to have one government, interim government, which was the hope in order to go towards elections and then unite the country. But let's look at the experiences we had. I mean, in Skhirat, that was the goal. It was called Government of National Accord and then Government of National Unity. And they all had the same idea, but it never worked. So maybe it's time to use the other school where we unite via elections, okay? The question would be, how can we run elections in this kind of division, and where the UN and international community can play a very practical role to make it sure there's a transparency and people, there will be acceptance of results and also accountability to those who do not participate. But Batili to focus on this element is very critical. So the selection criteria, there's so many ideas. The mandate should be very focused and clear with a clear timeline. And then the third question, who will actually endorse or let's say issue these laws when it's, let's say, agreed on? Where would it go back to the parliament to have it let's say rectified or approved? Or there's another mechanism, would it go back to if they fail, would they use the presidential council? That's one of the ideas that were there. I don't have an answer, but I'm just telling you, these are the challenges that and as long as he doesn't answer these questions, it will be very challenging for him also to kick off the process, because these are things that need to be known before, not during the process. So these are my points in general. I can go to other issues if wanted, but this is just my pitch in.
I think we should stop there for now because it's a perfect lead-in, Ambassador Al-Sani, to Ambassador Williams, acting special envoy and many other titled Williams, because she faced many of these issues and really the same cast of characters pretty much. And what we've seen is a pattern of the House of Representatives and the High State Council working together whenever it's necessary to maintain the status quo, to maintain this stability for themselves. At least that's my perspective. Yeah, Stephanie may well have alternative perspectives. I know she's got additional knowledge. I'm going to turn to her right now.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and I thank you to Middle East Institute, to Intisar, greetings to Mary and Saad Safir, Ambassador Tahir. It's great to be with you, and thank you for focusing on Libya. Look, I'll make a sort of a handful of points. First and foremost, goes without saying, SRSG Batili, deserves our unqualified support, whether that's from Libyans or from the international community, because we have to acknowledge the sheer complexity of his task, and that we know. And I'm not going to go over the ground that the ambassador so eloquently covered, but we know that the primary impediment to the completion of the constitutional and electoral process has been this thorny issue of the eligibility requirements for the presidential candidates. That's the essential, intensive, Libyan and international mediation that needs to take place, because it goes to the heart of what I've, written about, which is Libya's democracy dilemma. So all of the constitutional sort of negotiations heretofore have made quite clear that Libyans want a strong presidential system. That's, I think that ground has been, covered and it's been established. So therefore, it's, who comes to power? That's the rub. And that's why the hang up in the negotiation comes down to these requirements, because we don't have to look any further than 2021 when we had some rather controversial candidates emerge, and that sort of brought the entire process to a halt. So you have to tackle this essential kind of, democracy dilemma in order, and that's not something that's just held within, for instance, it's a dilemma that's captured within the negotiations between the councils. That reflects all of the political forces, all of the, influences that come in, no matter who is around the table. I would just postulate that. While this is going on, because the focus will be, okay, let's just return to the political process, right? The high level national political negotiation. Very important, but you have to walk and chew gum at the same time, which means that you need to equally engage on the other, so-called Berlin tracks. The security track, where we see the SRSG is really engaging smartly, the meeting in Cairo, pushing on the departure of the mercenaries, working on the thorny issue of DDR, but also the economic track, which has been unfortunately neglected, I think, to the detriment of everybody. These sovereign institutions that Tahir talked about, the major state institutions around which I think there are lots of questions of transparency and accountability. So I think some re-engagement on the economic track will be important. Look, I understand that the desire will be to go for another interim government, the musical chairs that the ruling class likes to play. I'm not going to comment on the merits or the, or the deficits of such a move. I will say the LPDF roadmap, and this was neglected, unfortunately, was very clear that any interim executive must be small, technocratic, with just discrete tasks, and really should be put into a chastity belt in terms of the budget. And that the key to that belt needs to be, held by the international community, because otherwise the impetus will be Muhassasa, another big, what I call the Frankenstein governments. They're too big, they're too dumb, and they're too stupid, and they're too scary. They're too scary. They bring in figures that are very, very polarizing. So that would just be my comment. If in fact that's where this goes, sort of back to the interim government phase. Look, I think one thing that everyone needs to keep in mind is that Libya is still, I believe, the subject of a major disinformation campaign. So this is what happened in the LPDF that we held in Tunis and Geneva. And in fact, it was established that the Internet Research Agency conducted a campaign against the LPDF. Facebook took down something like over 100 pages. And we know that Libya is a Facebook country with more Facebook accounts than there are citizens, and that hate speech was used, that women who participated in the dialogue were directly targeted. So I think, advanced knowledge and sensitivity to that will be key. Also, I think, just quickly on walking and chewing gum at the same time, you've written about this, Jonathan. I've written about this is decentralization. So don't forget, to work on all these other projects. And, we don't know exactly when the national track is going to be completed. But in the meantime, there can be a doubling down on real decentralization in Libya. And this was one aspect that the two chambers, I think, did quite well during the talks in Cairo, outlining what a decentralized model could look like and inserting that into the constitutional track. Last but not least, the international community cannot forget the human rights and international humanitarian law track. This is really key because we see that there's the civil society space is shrinking in Libya, that the abrogation of basic human rights, continues apace with complete impunity. And I would be remiss if just 6 days before International Women's Day, I didn't mention the specific targeting of women activists, starting, of course, Salwa Boughakis, Fariha Barkawi, the GNC member who was gunned down in 2014, Hanan El-Barasi, who was killed in broad daylight in Benghazi while we were conducting the LPDF, and of course, the member of parliament, Dr. Siham El-Sargewa, who disappeared in Benghazi in July 2019. And there's been no accountability and no word as to what happened to her. I'll stop there.
There are a lot of challenges facing Libya and everyone who would try and help Libya move forward. We've had some questions from our participants about how one builds reconciliation and stabilization and the role of inclusion in getting Libyan buy-in. And I'm interested, Mary, in your thoughts on those issues as you look at the Batili initiative and the responses of the likely responses of the House of Representatives and High State Council and other major actors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Well, I think we could say that Batili's initiative makes the prospect of elections more likely. However, to say that we're likely to see elections in 2023 is still, I think, an open question. Interesting that earlier today, the State Council voted to approve the 13th Amendment to the Constitutional Declaration that was adopted last month by the HOR. And this raises all kinds of questions in terms of Batili's initiative. Batili himself, in his briefing to the Security Council, referred to that 13th Amendment as controversial for a number of reasons, including the fact that the eligibility question that both Ambassador El-Sani and Ambassador Williams mentioned earlier. But also this is an interesting development today because it raises the question of whether we're going to see a divergence now in terms of Batili's initiative, but then the State Council and the House of Representatives pursuing their own initiative. And there are reasons to believe that both bodies are really not an idea of elections anytime soon. Just last week, we saw the Egyptian foreign minister also welcoming the adoption of the 13th Amendment, which raised questions over whether the Egyptians are very supportive of Bathili's initiative. So I think there's all that kind of mood music happening at the moment that raises all kinds of questions about how the initiative may. What Ambassador Al-Sunni and Ambassador Williams mentioned earlier, the devil is in the detail. And it's been interesting in the last days, just looking at some of the Libyan reactions to Bathili's initiative, people wondering whether this is the LPDF 2.0, people raising questions over whether we're going to see a highly contested weeks and months ahead where we see Bathili's in terms of its composition, but also its procedures. And, you know, the representation question has been one that has really dogged every UN process since 2014. This question of who is truly representative, whether, you know, we're talking about tribal representatives, civil society, political representatives, this has basically been an issue in every UN process. Not going to change, I think, with this one. And that, of course, begs a further question of that broad national consensus that this initiative is hoped to build on. But I think it's also worth noting, just to take a step back here and remind people that when it comes to the idea of elections, there remains a great appetite for elections in Libya. A great reset, a great appetite for truly legitimate institutions with a proper robust mandate. And if you look at late 2021, 2.8 million Libyans registered for the elections that were supposed to happen in December 2021. In the weeks leading up to December 2021, we saw 2.4 million Libyans showing their intention to vote in those planned elections. And I think that that's always worth reiterating, because it shows that Libyans, whether they disagree on whether they want a presidential system or whether parliamentary elections should take priority, they desperately want a reset. It's worth noting yet again, the House of Representatives was elected in 2014. Is a reworking of the General National Congress voted in 2012. It's extraordinary that we're still talking about those two institutions, and certainly the frustration on the part of ordinary Libyans expresses the fact that they really want to see the end of those two institutions. I think it's also important to ask the question of if elections do not happen this year, what may happen on the ground as a result. Of course, there's always a risk to a return to some form of armed conflict, clashes between armed groups in different parts of the country. But I think also there's a risk of public unrest. We have seen over the last year, the year before that, public protests erupting, driven by young Libyans who are frustrated with the situation, who are very frustrated with these political institutions that remain in place years after they were voted in. And also, I think it's worth remembering this youth dynamic, the demographics of Libya as they stand right now, the fact that similar to other countries in the region, a population that presents, of course, challenges, but also opportunities. And certainly Libyan youth have shown that they can be disruptors through protests, movements, etc. It's been very interesting to see the Government of National Unity recognize this during its lifespan. Also, the House of Representatives, more the GNU, through offering the so-called marriage allowance scheme, where they're offering Libyan couples who get married the equivalent of about $8,000 US dollars in order to encourage them to get married. They're offering them land, housing, etc. This all indicates that finally Libyan political entities are waking up to the fact that, again, the youth effort is really crucial in terms of dampening down discontent. So I would leave it with that, but I think, again, reiterating what's happening on the ground in terms of some of the discontent and the frustrations that remain bubbling under the surface beyond the political dynamics.
Thank you very much, Mary. There are a tremendous number of challenges. It's an incredibly complicated tapestry of constituencies and even competing modalities. It almost seems as if the House of Representatives and High State Council are jockeying to maintain control. And that Patili's initiative is an effort perhaps to shift control from the House of Representatives initiating and controlling the process, because that didn't really work last time. I'd like to start first with Ambassador El-Sani on this question of a Berlin III process. There's been some discussion of a Berlin III. You said in your opening comments that you spend most of your time focusing on getting internationals aligned, letting others work with Libyans. Given your position, your focus is on the external side. How do you see that a Berlin III is potentially being constructive? Is it necessary? Is it useful? And for it to be successful, what has to happen with the internationals? What should they be doing?
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Before that, I just got a note that there was a statement issued by the Secretary of the High State Council that the voting was not legal that happened, and questioning the whole process. So we're back now to another state of, controversial situations expected. But this is just for the info for everyone listening, that this was just announced a while ago, just I think an hour ago or so. Now, in terms of the, before answering Jonathan on the Berlin process, any gathering that brings in the troublemakers, I call them, together in order to reach an agreement and move forward is always going to be welcomed. So the same way we're looking at the Libyan dialogue, whatever, we need kind of an international forum, a kind of a dialogue. I think Berlin was kind of that intention, and thanks to Germany, they have been really sincere and I would say even neutral when this comes. The challenge we have now that up to Berlin 1 and 2, we didn't have the Ukraine-Russia war. And that's a factor that will impact and affect any international gathering, especially if we talk about Berlin 3. It will be a question, will Russia be able to attend, or will they be willing or invited? And Russia is a key player when it comes to this. So that's something that is now comes back to the UN facilitation process and the work with Germany, if they're going to be willing to. But the question is, what is the outcome expected? I think that any conference like that, if it doesn't have kind of a prerequisite where there is a plan that is put in place, let's say, for example, just hypothetically, let's say that Batili has the backup and he's going to launch his process. So that's where you would see maybe Berlin 3 coming in to endorse or support or welcome this initiative. And then if there's any bottlenecks around it or things that are kind of worrying, especially regional players who have a proxies and their influence in the country, that's where the mediation and the UN/international community can address in that kind of conference. But if it's just going to be a conference generic to do it the other way around, bring those and discuss what they are bothered with before there's even something on the ground to talk about in terms of a process, I don't think we're going to benefit from it. So I would rather see it in a later stage after we see where the UN-led process will take. And I always say that when we say about the Libyan-owned process, and how Libyans can take, initiative, I mentioned the 3 key things that are not available in the Libyan scene, but still, I say it's a Libyan-owned and UN-facilitated. So that's the formula that we can have, and the challenge will yet be how can you have proper representation around the table when it comes to certain issues. So let me give you an example. Many are debating now that if this high-level panel, electoral panel, should be technocrats, like our technical forum, discussing the electoral laws and constitutional basis. This is one direction. Or if we're talking about more a group of people discussing the political challenges behind it. We know that the issue is not the legal writing of those laws. It's not about how are they going to have a group of judges or lawyers or wherever we're going to write the articles. So it's a combination of a political issue, questions the eligibility of parts for presidential elections, even the idea of the simultaneous versus, not doing them together, parliamentary and presidential, this issue of, the whole point of even what roles and responsibilities the new president will have, and the checks and balances to have a kind of a balanced approach in the future. All of these are questions that is politically driven as well. And this is part of the challenges we have. So that on the Berlin process, I think that's when I'm dealing with these countries here, I see that unfortunately we're under the mercy of what's happening in other files. So Syria, what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in Ukraine, all of these battles. They meet every day in the council to discuss these things together, and they have their challenges. Then when Libya file comes in, we're not on the top priority of many of those countries. We're just an outcome. We tend to think maybe back home that we're on the top list of the bigger players, but unfortunately that's not the case. We're kind of one part of the dilemma. But I use this argument also with the United Nations, with the SG and others. I say, well, okay, still, if you compare the complexity of the Libyan file to the others, we're a bit simpler, in a way. Not easy, but simpler. So fix one of those. Let Libya be the one that has a success story, let's put it this way. But let me tell you of the opportunity we have, Jonathan, even despite all what's happening. Unfortunately, nobody is happy with the war in Ukraine, and of course it has its total impact around the world for many areas. But because of that war, Europeans are somehow united now, on a cause, and this is helping us back home, because there was this clear competition happening from some European countries. Of course, it's still there, but it's much less, and the influence is much less. So this is our opportunity. Gulf countries' reconciliations that happened in the past year or so is helping us back home as well, because there's less stress and less polarization. So take these elements and dynamics. For me, this is a window of opportunity, but a very short one, because we want to grasp that opportunity as soon as possible, so we maybe can push forward. I just want to add to another point on the methodology that has been used, and I'm here not trying to criticize Stephanie, your work, or Jonathan when you were there, but it's lessons learned on the Libyan context. I think that the top-bottom approach that has been used from Bernardino Leon and onwards by the UN, which is maybe sounds proper in terms of dealing with institutions and trying to have them representing Libyans and then deal with them on a situation for reconciliation or for a political agreement, is the nice formula how we want to see it. But the reality in the Libyan context and many countries within our region and in Africa, you need to go to the roots, you need to go to the base, to start from the base. So why I always mention that the national reconciliation process has been left away, and all the other tracks that are introduced, from my point of view, I call them the technical tracks. You have a political track, economic track, military track, okay? But when national reconciliation wasn't there, you have seen that there's no way to influence the outcomes of the other three tracks. So I see that it's an advantage now that we have some kind of platform on the national reconciliation front, where it's being worked with the Presidential Council and AU. I'm hoping that with Batili, who comes from Africa, to be able to use this platform to complement the other tracks, and to have, I'm not saying that necessarily they're going to decide on behalf of others, and stuff like that, but they can complement it. And in that sense, you have at least some kind of pressure on politicians from the ground. Civil society will be there, or tribal leaders, etc. This is the forum where we bring all of those people together. The ex-regime, also loyalists, all of these people, you need them there. If they reach some kind of agreements, trust and me that nobody else can really override it easily. And they will have really a strong power to push the other tracks forward. So I think the bottom-up approach is the right one to do, in parallel with what's happening now. So these are my just quick comments, and over to you, Jonathan.
Ambassador Al-Sani, for me, that was incredibly interesting and fresh, because you just highlighted something that crystallized something that I've not heard before, and maybe it's because I wasn't listening hard enough, which is the idea of a national reconciliation track, and the notion that the political track has been too much high-end and hasn't been sufficiently inclusive to reach more deeply into Libyan society, and thus get beyond the goals of particular power brokers. And that idea strikes me as a very significant idea. The question of how one implements it is a big question. And with that, I'd like to be very interested in Stephanie's reaction to what Berlin 3 might usefully do. Lessons learned from Berlin 1 and 2, both of which she was an active participant, endured, and took advantage of both. And Mary, I'd be very interested in your thoughts about Russia's role at this point, both in Libya, domestically, its role diplomatically in terms of these kinds of processes, because you've written about Russia and Africa recently. And then if you address anything else that's on your mind as well. But I'm going to go next to Stephanie. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, so I was, of course, intimately involved in Berlin 1. We had 6 Sherpa meetings in advance between the time that, Hassan met with Angela Merkel on August 15th of 2019 and the actual conference itself, which was January 19th of 2020. So, and I think the advantage, I wasn't involved in Berlin 2, that happened during the hiatus in my UN employment. But the advantage of what we did in Berlin 1 is we had an operational paper. So we had the actual conclusions, and then we had, which Hassan and I basically wrote this operational paper for, it's the UN's plan of action, which was blessed by, so everyone knew what we were doing. It was laid out. It was that operational paper is still online. I don't believe that an operational paper, for instance, was adopted in Berlin 2. So I would argue that the more you get into the details where you actually are, because the purpose of the Berlin framework, which I think is still very relevant, by the way, you do not need to reinvent the wheel. As long as you continue to have a dysfunctional Security Council where you don't know the differences between the Perm 5, you do have now the breach with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but you still have the need to herd the regional cats around a table. And that was Berlin. We brought in the interfering regional parties and we brought in all of the regional organizations. So yes, it's difficult now to meet at the most senior level with the Russian question, but Berlin is still effective at the senior officials level and at the international working groups level. There are international working groups which intersect with the Libyan tracks. That needs to be sustained because, when Mr. Batili is then able to say, here's where we are on the political track, then everyone can fold in under this international umbrella. By the way, the national reconciliation track was determined in Berlin 1. It was decided. That's when the African Union was formally designated as having this particular task, which is to work side by side with the UN mission and the Libyan Presidential Council on the task, the very important task of national reconciliation, which I believe, should not just, devolve down to sort of, a compensation track. It needs to be much deeper than that. It needs to address these, real issues of accountability and the institution, genuine institution of the rule of law.
Stephanie, on that last point, what could be done to revivify, bring that national reconciliation track up to a higher level? And how do you see that relating, if at all, to the new steering group?
Well, look, I think that the African Union is already working with the Presidential Council. Again, I don't have the latest, but I recall in my discussions with the Presidential Council last year, there was a lot of, I think, controversy again on this issue of who is appointed to the commission. So it's always the names, and then the problem of tahmish, the people who don't feel that they are marginalized, or constituencies feel that they are marginalized in this process. So I think they can accompany, the tracks can all accompany each other. I think there's, one of the things I already noticed was when I came back in 2021 in December, there was already a lot of kind of natural reconciliation that was taking place. The good work that was started under Prime Minister Siraj with, Ahmed Matig, of inviting, former regime supporters who had decamped to Cairo. And that process had started. It is accelerated. I think the current Justice Minister of the GNU is playing a nice role in this regard. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening already quietly, that I think can all help, smooth the way forward, inshallah.
I see Mary nodding to some of this. Mary, if you could address national reconciliation as well as Russia, I'd be grateful.
Yes, so, I think if you look at the whole idea of national reconciliation 2011, a big risk has been that national reconciliation initiatives become politicized. And that happened actually to quite a few of the initiatives between 2011 and 2014. I think the fact that the African Union is involved now with the Presidential Council, they're planning a national reconciliation conference later this year. That's a different dynamic to what we've seen in the past, see the fruits that are produced by that. But, going back to what Stephanie was saying, I think it's also when you talk to Libyans about how they define national reconciliation, you will get many different answers. Reconciliation in Libya can refer to what happened before 2011 and the ousting of Gaddafi. It can refer to what happened during the uprising, or what happened in 2014 and the years that followed from that. So you'll get many different questions. There's no one definition, if you like. And as Stephanie mentioned, we're seeing a lot of organic kind of reconciliation, or at least a kind of a warming of relations that's happening outside an actual reconciliation process, a structured process. But many of those kind of dynamics are by personal interests, etc. We're seeing over the last 3 to 4 months very unlikely, unusual kind of rapprochements happening between key figures who were at odds with each other just a few years ago. So I think we're going to see that continuing outside of a structured reconciliation process, and it'll be interesting to see the fruits that are produced there. On the Russian presence, we know that there's considerable concern in Europe and in the US regarding Russia's presence in Libya, but on the continent of Africa more generally. The Russian presence in eastern southern Libya is projected through Wagner mercenaries. We know that this presence the goal for foreign fighters, foreign mercenaries to leave Libya. And SRSG Bethili last month in Cairo, the meeting, the 5+5, etc., with representatives from the Chadian and Nigerian government, that was very much focused on fighters from the region. And, while a positive in terms of progress on that file, that is not as significant as the Russian presence or indeed the Turkish presence in Libya in terms of the departure of those forces. But I think we're likely to see more and more pressure when it comes to the Russian presence in Libya. The French President Emmanuel Macron is in Africa this week on a visit that is about many things, but including countering Russian influence on the continent more generally. I think that we've seen quite some ambivalence in Africa more generally towards the Ukraine war, has really focused minds in Europe in terms of how to counter existing Russian influence in the continent, and that, of course, includes Libya.
Back when I was special envoy, at one point I said to the Egyptians, if you'd like, the United States would be happy to facilitate talks with your most difficult relationship, Turkey. And the response that I got was, well, why don't you solve Libya first, and then you can talk about Turkey-Egypt relations after that, because Libya is way easier. But more recently, we've seen Egypt and Turkey have some bilateral discussions. And that seems to be something that may potentially be resolvable in terms of Libya. If the internationals can all be aligned in support of processes that move Libya forward, that would surely make a very big difference, as Ambassador El-Sani suggested. We've had a lot of questions from our audience about how Libyans can run the show. And Tahir earlier talked about Libyan-owned, UN facilitated as the formula. And it's a very good phrase. It's something that's easy to understand, but what's harder to understand is how it happens in practice, because of the constant efforts by various status quo actors to maintain their power. And so I'm going to ask the question now of everybody, As we have this new initiative from Batili, we have the reaction from HOR, State Council, whatever the vote was or wasn't today. What steps can be taken to have the internationals facilitate Libyan-led processes that lead somewhere, as opposed to that stall somewhere? It's been my perception that since 2014, very, very often the House of Representatives has really been interested in maintaining its authority rather than facilitating the development of alternatives to its authority. And that the High State Council has similarly sought to perpetuate what was described earlier as the recreation of the General National Congress in Tripoli. And the interim governments were never supposed to be more than a year. But the al-Sarraj government was supposed to be a year to 2 years absolute maximum. And the process that Stephanie oversaw similarly was supposed to be a short-lived process that ended, I believe, at the end of 2021, if I can keep my years straight. And so the question is, how do we avoid repeating that past in something that is a Libyan-owned process where there's Libyan buy-in, Libyan trust, Libyan self-determination, rather than foreign interference? That's a pretty broad set of questions. So I'm going to leave it there and open it up to whoever would like to respond to it. Probably for simplicity, we should go in the same order that we've gone.
Yes. So that's the kind of key question, Jonathan, which is very difficult to answer now in a couple of minutes. But I can go back to a fundamental challenge we have overall. Why all of this is happening in Libya? Why is this kind of power struggle happening? And how can we maybe diffuse it, regardless of the political scene today? I think the fact that we have a more centralized government system, okay, where the wealth of the country is only channeled through the capital and controlled by the capital. I think this is the fundamental challenge we have in the Libyan society and the Libyan structure. And this is why we have all of these kind of challenges. If we have managed through our constitution in the near future, or through mechanisms in interim that can support the decentralization concept, where there's no reason to fight over Tripoli, no reason to go after, where the oil company and the central bank is sitting. It's more about this kind of introductory to this decentralization and financial management system that is transparent and also that is everybody can benefit from. Now, this opens the door on the question, should we go to a federal system? Should we stay as we are? These are things that are kind of debatable, and we can talk about it in another context. But I think fundamentally, if the UN wants to help in this interim process, to not only fix the political part of what to do in terms of elections, but to help open a debate and discussion within Libyans, how to come with a transparent financial management system, okay? And that will allow decentralization in terms of local governance and real implementation of this. And it could be part of the package that any new government must apply, okay, even if it's an interim setup. But that's a fundamental thing. The second point I see is that we need to not neglect the fact of weapons and security and armed groups and the influence of all of these. It's all over the country in one way or another with different reasonings, with different reasons. I'm not going to go to the history, who's good or bad, but the concept and the idea is, are the problems there? We do acknowledge the work and we appreciate the Joint Security Committee 5+5 job, but there are always going to be a point where they cannot advance without finalizing the political scene and agree on that, because the Supreme Command role and all of that other details and who's going to be there, that's always going to be. But let's try to invest in what they're doing today. Today, they're doing a lot of joint tasks. They're working together. There's a lot of good intention to do. This is very, very important. And not to use them and not to politicize this kind of track. It's very critical. But I think this is a good investment. If we can now have the UN and international community, and I always call on even my colleagues here in the Secretariat and the UN, then we must have some more support on the SSR and DDR programs but something that is embedded in the government institutions in a way that is more sustainable. So it's a program that will be carried forward. It's not just a one-stop incident where you just do this and this, and like the security arrangements in the Khairat agreement was a particular detail for a certain reason. No, I'm talking about the medium long-term plan, where it is part of the mandate of the government to work in with the support of others. So the SSR and DDR are very critical. And then the economic part, the challenge, where are these youth going to go? I mean, I see the potential all over the country. I'm sure you guys dealt with so many Libyans, youth in particular. They're very eager to start, but they don't know from where to start. So the economic sector is very critical. And the fact, and again, opportunities we're talking about, that the energy sector and any challenges that could happen in Libya due to the energy is an advantage for us, because the world the dynamics now cannot, or the regional players, or what's happening in Ukraine, they cannot afford another challenge when it comes to shutting down oils anymore. So this is a stability kind of entry point where we have a win-win. So help us in the stability of Libya, then you will guarantee this kind of thing going on. Now, on the part of the whole idea of financial management, I think one of the key things that should happen now in this interim period or in the future, to make sure that the incentive of having elections, okay, is kind of, or let me rephrase this. There should be a mechanism of financial management, a Libyan system, where it's no longer beneficiary to be controlling this kind of financial wealth or resources. Therefore, the incentive will be to go to elections in order to have a unified government, and then the government will be dealing with the resources. So this whole idea of having a joint committee, the ideas of having a focused in the interim period on a financial management system that will only talk about the initial day-to-day service, etc., I think it will be somehow good in the future. But it has to be also planned well to make sure that it's not really the struggle of resources that we're talking about, and also have assurances when it comes to elections, there's a fair election system. My last point is that for Batili, he needs to really work hard with the regional players. You mentioned a lot of them already. So this is where he needs to focus in parallel with, of course, Logo. I think he should go back to Libya now and discuss with them his proposal to try to get some ideas and have more buy-in. I would say that if HOR and State Council today corrects what is missing in these amendments that they had did, then let's let it be and let's go with that. I mean, everybody wants that. It's not that we have to go with Batili's plan, but we cannot also prolong the process. So giving the benefit of the doubt, let's see, maybe this will pressure HOR and State Council to have them rework and re-edit what they did in order to go forward. That will be really the hope of us. But we cannot stay forever at the same time. And accountability that Stephanie mentioned is very key. So if the Security Council is going to issue any resolution, and then it's going to be just, like written on paper, and there's no accountability in terms of spoilers, there's no point of all of this. It's not going to work. So these are my points, Jonathan, and over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Economic reform, economic sharing in ways that empower municipalities to provide services at the local level, finding some solutions for young people in Libya, particularly given the very high unemployment among younger people, is clearly part of the solution, as well as dealing with security arrangements now rather than at the very, very end of all processes. We're coming to the end of our time. I'd like last thoughts from Stephanie, last thoughts from Mary.
Yeah, real quick to add on to what Taher has laid out. Use sticks. The international community does have sticks. We know that there are, status quo transactional actors in Libya. The United States, the United Kingdom, the EU in particular, have sanctions that they can use, the Magnitsky sanctions. So we know that in the case of the United States, those sanctions can't be applied to American citizens, but their partners, our partners in the UK and EU, can use these sanctions with regard to both those who are robbing the patrimony of the Libyan people. These are those who are at the government trough and predating on the institutions. who like to visit their money, which they park in many European capitals and in the United States. So sanctions, isolation, but also for those who commit human rights abuses. And the United States started that with designating the Kaniyat group, but I would argue there are many others who could probably also be included. That helps to, you're setting the rules of the road then, and you're saying there will be a price if you continue to obstruct, the will of the Libyan people to get to elections as soon as possible.
Mary, final thoughts?
Yes, I would add to what Stephanie said. Beware the risks of muddling through. Everyone pays lip service to the idea of elections. But ultimately, there's a good enough situation on the ground in Libya at present. We've had a ceasefire in place since October 2020. Humanitarian indicators are improving. Oil is flowing, deals are being struck. There's a sense among many internationals that a return to all-out conflict is unlikely. But I think there are risks to that idea of a good enough situation, with this sense of, muddling through is acceptable. And to go back to what Stephanie said, I think the call of ordinary Libyans over the last 2 years has been really strong. They want elections, they want a reset, they want institutions that have a robust democratic mandate.
Well, Libya needs to be able to get beyond its impasse. We've had some ideas on some of the elements of it. And let's hope that Libyans can own the solutions and the internationals can facilitate them in 2023, and we get to elections and an inclusive, effective, clean, robust Libyan government that shares revenues locally and with its people to whom the government belongs. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks so much.